Seal a peace deal. Hello and a very warm welcome to Africa Live on CGTN. I'm Lindy Mtongana in Nairobi. Also coming up this hour. In your business news, China's yuan weakens further on Wednesday. And Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates provide 540,000 tons of wheat to support Sudan. Well, we start today's program in Somalia, where AMISOM forces and the Somali National Army have taken control of a key southern town from militant group Al-Shabaab in a joint operation. According to the head of AMISOM, the capture of Al-Dwegle is part of a wider offensive on Al-Shabaab, which is being carried out by the state and the AU mission. The agriculturally rich town has been under the jihadist command for several years now. It was mainly being used by Al-Shabaab for planning and logistics. Security forces drawn from AMISOM and the Somali National Army are now currently patrolling the streets of the town. Let's get you more on this development. I'm joined here in our Nairobi studio by Matthias Mundi, an independent political risk analyst based here in Nairobi, specializing on the Horn of Africa and Great Lakes regions. Matthias, always a pleasure to have you with us. This, of course, as we understand, is a very significant development. The capture of this town from Al-Shabaab, considered a major blow for the terror group. But on the other hand, just how significant a victory is this for AMISOM and Somali forces?
It is a psychological blow to the militant group Al-Shabaab, considering that they have been in control of this town for a number of years. When you look at the region of Lower Shabelle in southern Somalia, that is the heartland of Al-Shabaab. So for them to lose a key town like this, it's something which represents a psychological blow. On the other hand, Lower Shabelle is also an agricultural heartland. So the fall of the town could also disrupt, food supplies to these fighters, and it could also cripple financial inflows for the militants, because they engage in, taxation of local farmers who are based around the town.
So what you're saying then is that this is not only a psychological blow for Al-Shabaab, but also a financial one. Just talk us through some of the other local sources of funding beyond agriculture that these militants are relying on.
The biggest source of funding for Al-Shabaab in southern Somalia has always been trading in charcoal and illegal taxation of anybody doing business in southern Somalia. They control the regions of Lower Shabelle and Jubaland, which are some of the agriculturally rich areas of Somalia. So if anybody is doing business in these regions, they are likely to come across Al-Shabaab checkpoints which demand a certain percentage, and that is what has been used to fund operations by the group, considering that international restrictions on financial inflows into Somalia have restricted external funding for the group.
So in a sense, though, to choke the funding of Al-Shabaab indeed is important for AMISOM forces, for the Somali armed forces, but we've still seen that Al-Shabaab is able to carry out some very powerful, very brazen attacks throughout the country. How do we balance this progress and at the same time defeat?
One of the biggest changes of strategy by Al-Shabaab happened when they lost Mogadishu a couple of years ago. When they lost Mogadishu, after that they started, withdrawing, or maybe tactically leaving the key cities like Kismayo in the south. What they did instead was to go and have cells, based around these cities, which they can later use to infiltrate and carry out these attacks. The attacks you see in Mogadishu and the attacks you have seen in Kismayo in the last 1 month are attacks carried by cells which have been infiltrating these cities. The other element is that when you look at the sophistications of some of the attacks you see in Mogadishu, they indicate a level of infiltration also of the Somali security forces, who could maybe be sharing intelligence with some of the members of Al-Shabaab.
And when you consider the role that AMISOM has played in this particular development and, of course, in other operations that the two have been working on together, when will we see the point that Somali armed forces are able to fight this insurgency completely alone and without the assistance of AMISOM?
It is coming close to 10 years since AMISOM went into Somalia, and there's been a lot of financial and military investment into the Somali security forces, but they have not been able to be in a position whereby they can defeat this insurgency. So as AMISOM starts the process of drawing down in terms of its operation in Somalia, Possibly the next thing they need to think is about having a political discussion with the moderate elements in Al-Shabaab and see whether they can come to a consensus and have a government which can run that country. Because we have seen in 10 years, the military option has largely failed to defeat Al-Shabaab.
And yet at the same time, the pulling out of AMISOM forces might be seen as an opportunity for Al-Shabaab. A complicated situation indeed. Thank you so much, Beatrice Lindy, joining us here in our Nairobi studio. Well, in other security matters, Ukraine is now confirming that one of its planes was hit at Libya's Misrata airport on Wednesday. A statement released by Ukraine's foreign ministry says the plane's tail was destroyed, slightly injuring some of the crew members. It also says travel documents belonging to one of the pilots were also destroyed. The entire crew of that plane has been evacuated to a safe location. The plane was ferrying humanitarian cargo meant for the Libyan Red Crescent when the incident occurred. The Libyan government has blamed the airstrike on Southern Commander Khalifa Haftar's forces. And turning to news now from Southern Africa, Mozambique's government and the ex-rebel group Renamo completed a long-awaited peace pact on Tuesday, inking a final deal aimed at ending years of conflict. The deal was signed by President Filipe Nyusi and Renamo leader Osofo Momade in Maputo's Peace Square and witnessed by former presidents and regional and continental leaders. CGTN's Daniela Pearson has more.
Mozambican President Filipe Nyusi and Renamo leader Osofo Momade have signed a long-awaited peace pact. Named the Maputo Peace and Reconciliation Agreement, it aims to end years of conflict between the government and the ex-rebel group.
The agreement that we have signed is an agreement of brothers who've come to the decision that there is no longer a reason to continue killing each other. This is not an agreement between enemies. It's an agreement which proves that we do not want war anymore between us.
The end of fire must mean the beginning of a new era that must be characterized by the acceptance of different thinking and peaceful political cohabitation.
The signing ceremony in Maputo's Peace Square was witnessed by regional and continental leaders.
What we can assure you, President Nyusi and Mr. Momade, is that we as South Africa will walk this journey with you. You will never walk alone. We will always be there with you.
In a world that is full of conflicts, where everything seems to go in the wrong direction, you are giving us hope today. Mozambique is giving us hope, Africa is giving us hope, and you have to be proud of that, as we are proud of you tonight.
The peace deal comes just 2 months before general elections on October 15th. As the dominant political force for more than 4 decades, President Nyusi's Frelimo party is expected to win. But analysts doubt that the peace deal will hold for long. Some see the agreement as a way for elections to go ahead. In the past, the opposition Renamo party has been known to dispute elections. Daniela Pearson, CGTN.
Well, let's bring you more now on this peace deal in Mozambique. We're joined live from Johannesburg by CGTN's Angelo Coppola. Angelo, perhaps just take a step back and explain for us over the decades just how much of a problem this Renamo rebellion has been for governance in Mozambique and how this deal might change things going forward.
Well, Lindy, when Renamo went into the mountains in the Gorongosa province after the last elections, there were concerns at that stage that this low-level conflict that they'd initiated would escalate and spread into the other provinces. It was contained and to a greater or lesser extent and kept in the province. It's been a thorn in the side of the ruling party for the last couple of years, and this latest deal doesn't change anything just yet, but it's an agreement to approach those elections in October unarmed. There are, as you know, probably around 5,000 armed Renamo fighters. They will be disarmed over time and reintegrated into their communities. It's been a slow process. Just the first 50 people have been through this registration process. 10 of them had weapons, the other 40 didn't, so we don't know exactly how many weapons are being kept. Observers are saying it's unlikely that those 5,000 will be disarmed in time for the elections, but that's the main aim. Excuse me, that's the objective. But that process has started, but it has been really slow, Lindy.
And Angelo, we know that the two sides have gotten as far as a deal in the past and those have not been able to hold. What makes this one different?
Well, I've been chatting to a political risk analyst myself, Gustavo Placebo, and he's a researcher at the IPRIS, which is the Portuguese think tank. And he tells me that this treaty might work this time. For starters, the natural gas industry is starting to take off. This is going to provide some business, some rent-seeking opportunities and revenues. That does require some effective peace and stability to be in place. Any type of a return to an armed conflict or recurrent episodes of violence are obviously going to deter investors and is going to stop projects from being developed. So Frelimo, which is the government at the moment, is interested in securing this stable and lasting peace. Renamo, on the other hand, will also gain from this new gas industry, I'm told, especially if it secures a strong political foothold in the local, provincial and national levels. This, he says to me, has been a key driver of this particular peace accord. Of course, alongside the foreign pressure that's been applied to a lesser extent, Lindy.
And Angela, of course, there is that temptation to call this Mozambique's new dawn. But realistically, what do we expect to happen next in the country, particularly in the lead up to elections?
Well, look, the first phase is obviously to get that disarming process moving at full speed, to get those people's weapons off the ground and into secure environments. That's hopefully going to be monitored by observers. The electioneering has already begun by the state. Ministers and deputy ministers already out there on official functions punting the government position. So that electioneering has started. According to some analysts and NGOs, it's probably going to irritate Renamo because they haven't been doing any electioneering at all. So some observers are in fact suggesting that key provinces voting rolls have already been loaded in favor of the ruling party. So those accusations are already starting to fly. Meanwhile, observers are wondering if there's going to be a body or a structure that's going to be created to mediate and resolve any of these particular issues between the two groups before they get to a non-resolvable situation. So it's hoped also that the details of this treaty and the disarming treaty will be released to the public so that people can understand what's been offered, what's been promised, and what the rules in play are, so that if one or both parties do actually pull out of the treaty, that they can understand what the reasons were, because they want that transparency, so that there's no arbitrage from either one of the two sides going into the elections and after the elections. Lindy.
Indeed, that transparency will be key. Thank you so much, Angela Coppola, joining us from Johannesburg. Now, armed groups of the rival Fulani and Dogon ethnic communities in central Mali have signed accords to cease hostilities. The accords, signed by a dozen armed groups, were reached in the Mopti and Sogor regions, which have seen a surge in tit-for-tat violence between the nomadic Fulani cattle herders and the sedentary Dogon farmers and hunters, claiming hundreds of lives. Since 2015, a jihadist group recruiting mainly from the Fulani people has clashed with the ethnic Dogon and also the Bambara communities, who in turn have created self-defense militias. Despite military help from France and the United Nations, Mali's government has struggled to calm this violence that began in the north of the country in 2012. Several ceasefires signed in the past proved ineffective at halting the violence. Now, Pakistan says it will downgrade diplomatic relations and suspend bilateral trade with India. The decision comes after a high-level meeting chaired by Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan as a response to New Delhi's move to revoke the special status of Indian-controlled Kashmir. Our correspondent Daniel Khan gives us more details.
The top security meeting was chaired by Prime Minister Imran Khan to review the situation in the wake of India's decision to strip occupied Kashmir of its special status. The meeting also decided to review Pakistan-India bilateral arrangements, take the matter to the United Nations and observe the upcoming Independence Day on August 14th in solidarity with Kashmiris. According to a statement issued after the meeting, Prime Minister Khan has directed that all diplomatic channels be activated to expose brutal Indian racist regime, design and human rights violations. He has also directed the armed forces to continue their vigilance. The meeting was attended by top civilian and military leadership, and it was also decided to recall Pakistan's ambassador from New Delhi and expel the Indian envoy. Daniel Khan, CGTN, Islamabad.
Well, time now for a short break. Here's what's still ahead on the program. Coming up, health ministers from the DRC and Rwanda agree on joint surveillance strategies to stem the spread of Ebola. And a South African charity opens its doors to help reduce the crisis of abandoned children.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Let's go to Egypt now. The country is mourning the victims of the latest terror attack that left 20 people dead and wounded 60 others. CGTN's Yasser Hakim takes a look now at how Egypt is confronting terrorism.
The bomb attack in Cairo this week has raised questions over the ongoing war on terrorism. The crackdown on extremists has intensified in the last few months.
There were groups like ISIL, Ansar Beit al-Maqdis and Agnad Misr, who used to infiltrate from Libya, but Hasm, affiliated to the outlawed Brotherhood, is the one that is still active and operates every once in a while, but the rest have been drastically weakened by the war.
According to official statistics agency CAPMAS, since the war on terrorism was launched in 2015, the number of terrorist attacks has dropped by over 85%.
The considerable success by the security forces is apparent in northern Sinai, where most of the fighting is taking place. The arrest and handover of terrorist leader Hisham Ashmawi from Libya and the terrorist cell in Kuwait dealt a major blow to the extremist groups in Egypt.
And in spite of the heavy losses in this week's bombing in front of the Cancer Institute in Cairo, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has vowed to continue the crackdown on extremism.
States do not develop using terrorism. They develop with commitment, hard work, good virtues and patience. We should build, not destroy and kill. We are sad because of the attack, but it will not stop us. We will continue in our path of construction and development.
Officials say the war on terrorism is in its final stages, and the latest bomb attack is merely an attempt by the terrorist groups to prove that they still exist on the ground, while Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has promised that the war on terrorism will end in a year's time. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
A flagship study from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is due to be released on Thursday. The UN body looked at the effects of a hotter planet. It also examined how human activities such as clearing forests affect temperatures. The report is intended to be used by governments to inform their policies on global warming. Environmental researchers and activists hope the report will back a vision of healthier food, people and forests that will help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and avert climate disaster. Now, around 3,000 children are abandoned each year in South Africa, and it's estimated that almost half of all pregnancies that lead to abandonment are the result of rape. A local charity known as Door of Hope has been doing its best to take in and take care of the children. CGTN's Daniela Pearson has that story.
Orphanages in South Africa are overwhelmed by the number of babies each year. Babies are simply left in the streets, but a few are abandoned on the doorsteps of baby homes, like Door of Hope.
Last night, around 8:30, the center went off, and then they looked at the camera screen only to find that there's a baby, and then they just went in front of the house and go get the baby. The baby arrived through the baby box.
The charity built what it calls the baby box in 1999 as a safe place for mothers to leave unwanted children. Since then, it has received more than 200 babies, but sadly, many more die before being rescued.
It's important to remember that they've been abandoned themselves. They've been abandoned by the partner of the father of their child. They've been abandoned often by their family. And they've been abandoned by their communities and society as a whole.
Thuli Malangu will miss out on her granddaughter's development. She and her daughter decided to give up the little girl for adoption because they could not raise her. Thuli's daughter became pregnant at 21.
They consider adoption as you are throwing a baby away. I chose not to follow through, break the chains. I chose, and I'm happier.
Adoption agencies and children's rights groups have been worried about a drop in the number of adoptions in the country. Just 1,186 children were adopted in 2018, a quarter of the number 8 years ago. Activists attribute the fall to a 2010 Children's Act, which introduced more stringent conditions in a bid to prevent child abuse and trafficking. The figures are likely to drop further under a proposal to ban adoption fees, which could push many private agencies to close. For now, the only hope for a home and safety are orphanages like this one. Daniela Pearson, CGTN.
Rwanda's Health Minister Diane Gashumba and her counterpart from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Pierre Kangudia, have held bilateral talks aimed at combating the Ebola outbreak. CGTN's Mohammed Abubakar reports.
The two leaders have met at Rwanda's border city of Rubavu to evaluate the implementation of strategic plans on Ebola.
I do not mean to say that Rwanda will follow exactly the Democratic Republic of Congo, but Rwanda will continue to work hand in hand, side by side with our sisters and brothers, to collaborate and strengthen our cooperation, to put in place stronger measures, joint measures to contain this epidemic.
I would like to thank the Republic of Rwanda once again for having taken this initiative to invite us so that we can set up a joint system for combating the disease, for joint surveillance, and for supervision to ensure that everything is done in a coordinated manner. By combining efforts, we can put an end to this epidemic, which has already killed so many people, as quickly as possible.
Last week, Rwanda briefly closed its borders to the DRC after a third case of Ebola was confirmed in Goma. The meeting sought to address the rapid spread of the deadly virus in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo's city of Goma, which borders Rubavu.
Rwanda and the DRC will advocate not only for these two countries in the bilateral exchanges we have had, we will do so for the benefit of all our peoples. As I have mentioned, the Republic of South Sudan, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and Tanzania.
The World Health Organization last month declared the Ebola outbreak in the DRC a public health emergency of international concern, with the epidemic having so far left at least 1,700 people dead. Mohammed Abubakar, CGTN.
Staying with health issues, Burundi is in the grips of a major malaria outbreak. The mosquito-borne disease has killed more than 1,800 people this year. The UN's humanitarian agency says the outbreak crossed epidemic proportions in May. Here's more with CGTN's Daniela Pearson.
5.7 million cases of malaria have been recorded in Burundi in 2019, according to the UN's humanitarian agency OCHA. That's a figure roughly equal to half of the tiny country's entire population. Burundi is also one of the poorest countries in the Africa Great Lakes region.
Everyone should know that malaria is a disease of the poor. As I said in terms of national health policy, malaria remains the leading cause of death.
According to OCHA, there are 3 factors driving the crisis: a lack of preventative measures like mosquito nets, along with climatic changes and increased movements of people from mountain areas with low immunity to malaria.
The day when everyone, let's say all the stakeholders in the health sector, come together and say, what are the problems we are facing in Burundi in the fight against malaria? That's the day when we will find a good solution to save human lives.
The country of only 11 million people previously declared a malaria epidemic in March 2017. Burundi's death toll from malaria now rivals that of Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But malaria is the bigger killer on the continent. The World Health Organization recorded nearly 220 million cases of the parasitic illness in 2017, with an estimated 400,000 deaths. More than 90% of malaria cases and deaths.
Up on Africa Live Biz. China's yuan weakens further on Wednesday. And Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates provides 540,000 tons of wheat to support Sudan.
Nigeria is my home. 160 million vibrant, ambitious individuals constantly seeking the perfect self-expression. It is these people who inspired me to be that person that is seen, to be a voice that is heard, and ultimately to be the anchor that I am. I have to tap in, tune in, and turn on the very best qualities within me to deliver the news. I'm Richard Nta, an anchor for CGTN.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Now, the People's Bank of China on Wednesday fixed the yuan central parity rate at 6.99 per US dollar. That, of course, is weaker than the level set on Tuesday when the yuan hit an 11-year low. Shares in Asia fell for an 8th straight session on Wednesday, but signs that China is stepping in to steady the yuan helped ease investors' fears of a possible global currency war. Of course, US stocks jumped more than 1% on Tuesday, snapping a multi-session losing streak. Washington has branded China a currency manipulator after the yuan breached the key 7.0 threshold against the dollar on Monday. China's central bank said on Tuesday that it is resolutely opposed to such a label and says again that China will never engage in competitive devaluation. Now, Deputy Governor Chen Yulu said the U.S. move is against its own definition for a currency manipulator.
China vowed over and over to keep its currency steady, and we did so during both the 1997 Asian financial crisis and the 2008 recession, helping stabilize global financial markets and recover the world economy. In fact, the effective exchange rate of the renminbi, real or nominal, has increased about 40% since 2005, when the government started to act on the exchange rate reforms. That's also why China's international payment surplus now takes a much smaller share of its GDP, falling from 9.2% to 0.4% in 14 years.
Meanwhile, global financial markets have seesawed once again as investors mulled over the implications of the U.S. declaring China a currency manipulator. Beijing says it deeply regrets the decision by the U.S. Treasury Department. Now, the People's Bank of China says the American action violates international rules and will significantly impact the global economy and its financial markets. Here's CGTN's Owen Fairclough with more.
Financial markets once again in turmoil amid fears over nothing less than the future of the global financial order. All because the US has branded China a currency manipulator after its renminbi, or yuan, dropped to its lowest level against the dollar since 2008. The Trump administration claims China is trying to offset US tariffs in the midst of a trade war. A lower valued yuan makes Chinese exports cheaper. China's central bank allows its currency to float within a narrow band and insists market forces, such as the impact of those tariffs, are responsible for the drop, not government intervention.
It is totally wrong for the U.S. Treasury Department to designate China as a currency manipulator. This neither meets basics of economics nor the quantitative criteria for so-called currency manipulators set by the U.S. Treasury, so we are firmly against it.
Indeed, as recently as May, the Treasury Department said China wasn't a currency manipulator because it didn't meet all three of these criteria: a significant bilateral trade surplus, a current account surplus, and persistent one-sided intervention in the foreign exchange market. That last point is now at the centre of this currency dispute, and the US wants the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, to intervene. And that's where this currency crisis starts to get complicated. The IMF includes China in what's called a basket of global currencies used to prop up member states if they run into trouble, and by extension, the global financial system. And yet the US wants the IMF to act as some kind of referee and decide whether China has manipulated its currency and apply some kind of remedial action if that's the case. But it's not clear what that would be. Despite this rapidly escalating crisis, the Trump administration still plans to host a Chinese delegation for talks in September, just as Washington plans to impose more tariffs that would effectively tax virtually all of China's exports to the US. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
Well, let's head back to the continent. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are providing Sudan about 540,000 tons of wheat to support the country. Now, Saudi news agency SPA and UAE news agency WAM report that the amount will cover basic food needs for 3 months, and 280,000 tons have already been supplied. The wheat is part of $3 billion worth of aid, which was pledged by the two Gulf states in April after President Omar al-Bashir was removed from power. Now, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have deposited about $500 million with the Sudanese central bank. The rest of the assistance will come in the form of food, medicine, and agricultural and petroleum products. And a lawsuit filed by a Sierra Leone community is showcasing how local groups in developing countries are now opting to use legal methods to address their grievances. Now, the lawsuit filed in March in the West African nation's High Court claims that $288 million in damages for the degradation or destruction of land, as well as the loss of livelihoods. Now, CGTN's Daniela Pearson tells us more.
Diamond mining in Sierra Leone accounts for 46% of the mining industry revenue. However, for some, mining of the mineral has come at an unforeseeable cost. Adi Kalia Bangura is among those affected by the blasting at Sierra Leone's largest diamond mine. His house is riddled with cracks in the walls and holes in his aluminium roof as a result of the rocks loosening through the years.
You see, behind there, it's all damaged. This place is all damaged.
For dwellers around the region, life has become unbearable. Water has been contaminated, and with no other alternative, they have opted to settle for less.
This water really not fine for we.
We get sick living here. Before this company arrived, this area had fine water.
This company not been begin for operate. We get a fine water.
Bangura is part of the group of residents in Koidu who have filed a lawsuit against diamond mining firm Octare Limited and other related companies. The complaint filed in Sierra Leone's High Court in March claims $288 million in damages. The group alleges Octare poisoned the water, destroyed houses, and failed to relocate hundreds of households away from the blast area. But the firm terms the lawsuit as an attempt to exploit the mine at the expense of national development. The company claims it has not used harmful chemicals in any of the blasting processes in Koidu mine. The lawsuits against foreign extracting companies have nearly doubled over the last decade. Daniela Pearson, CGTN.
And moving on now, the recently signed African Continental Free Trade Agreement is intended to increase trading amongst African nations as well as eliminate tariffs. But that's not the view in Nigeria. Experts in the country say the agreement is inconsistent with the nation's protectionist policies and may hinder the process of implementing the deal. Well, CGTN's Daniel Arapmoy explains.
Africa is currently forging ahead with its Free Trade Area project. However, the pact believed to create a $3.4 trillion economic bloc is causing a stir in the continent's largest economy. Just like many in Nigeria, Adeleke Adeleye views the African Free Trade Agreement as a threat.
It's definitely not a level playing field. And it's to me, I consider Nigeria the Lion of Africa. You know, we have the largest population, we have the largest market, so it feels like we're given so much. We're given so much for not enough.
Nigeria was one of the last of 54 African nations to back the agreement, only signing on last month. Now that it's in, some trade experts fear its long history of economic protectionism will undermine the bloc. At the same time, small manufacturers are worried Nigeria could be flooded with cheap goods from more competitive neighbors.
There is smuggling, but at least they are still trying to reduce the pressure. The thing is coming down now. Really, people are still trying to, some people are saying to survive, all those stuff, but the custom here at this command, they are trying their best.
Harmonization of the custom arrangements, particularly not just the custom tariffs, but also non-tariff barriers and technical barriers. I think these are something that have to be negotiated among the participants in the agreement that will try to eliminate the possibility of increased dumping and increased smuggling.
Africa's manufacturing industry accounts for only about 10% of the African Union's combined GDP of $3.4 trillion. In Nigeria, manufacturers face diverse production challenges that put them at a disadvantage when compared to their counterparts on the deal.
We were not, but we've signed. So we just have to be ready. We've signed, so there's no going back. We just have to be ready.
But many here, like Adeleye, are waiting and watching to see the African Free Trade Agreement turn around their businesses and the economy. Daniel Arapmoy, CGTN.
Well, that's all for now on Africa Live Biz. But coming up later on Global Business Africa, Kenya's NSE 20 share index drops to a 10-year low as the China-US trade row hits Kenyan stocks. Of course, we'll bring you more on that top of the hour. For now, back to you, Lindy.
Thanks, Uche. Well, let's take a short break. Here's what's still ahead on Africa Live. Coming up, enthusiasts throng the 40th edition of the South African Car Classic event in Pretoria.
Join us in Global Business and see Africa through our eyes. The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Panata, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
We start in South Africa now, where Cars in the Park is one of the biggest events on the Old Motor Club calendar. This year, its 40th edition attracted enthusiasts from all over the country. Here's CGTN's Julie Shire with more.
The sound that every petrol head lives for. And and there was plenty of it at this year's Cars in the Park. Now in its 40th edition, it continues to be a must for classic enthusiasts.
We give an opportunity each and everybody to display his vehicle. Currently we got 120 clubs that participate. We attract people from all over South Africa, even from Botswana. At this point in time, I think we got already about 2,500 cars on the track, and the number of spectators and exhibitors in total about 12,000.
Vintage models ranged from the oldest and rarest in the world to immaculately restored classics.
This is a 1903 Peugeot, and it is one of the very early cars that were designed and built. The French were exceptionally good mechanics and engineers, so it is a rather special car.
It's a 1961 Roadster. What makes it so special is we were fortunate enough to get people on board from Germany that helped us in the process of restoring the car to the book. Every single nut and bolt is cadmium plated, the correct color that it needed to be. It's restored just like it rolled off the factory in 1962.
With more than 2,500 classics on display, car lovers had a chance to dream.
Very, very impressed, I must say. Cars are very beautiful. Everything, I just like everything about the show.
The crowd and the vibe and the quality of cars that are here. You know, what you see here is amazing.
And two-wheel enthusiasts also had a chance to marvel at vintage motorcycles.
We've got an Indian, it's a V-twin engine, a 1911 Precision, which is the oldest motorbike on the stand. And it happens to be one of the most sought-after bikes as well. It's a very scarce bike.
Your future classic might be waiting for you at an event like this or at a classic car auction. It can prove to be a good investment, but for many here, it's just for the love of cars. Julie Shire, CGTN, Pretoria, South Africa.
And to Somalia now, where we bring you the story of a legendary Somali musician who, despite losing his sight, continues to nurture the next generation of local artists. CGTN's Abdulaziz Bilo caught up with Farah Sido Farah and filed this story for Mogadishu.
Farah Sido Farah is reminiscing his good old days when he performed some of his classic hits in the presence of a live audience. The 70-year-old's life took a turn for the worse a decade ago after losing his sight following years of ill health. But that hasn't distracted him from playing musical instruments, singing, and training a new generation of artists.
My musical career began back in the days when Aden Abdul was president of Somalia. My nephew worked as a journalist at the state-run Radio Mogadishu. He used to take me there, and that's where I recorded my first song that opened the path to my long musical career.
His first song is titled Maser, Somali for jealousy, a popular hit in the country back in the days. Farah says even though it doesn't reflect on his personal life, distrust among married couples is a factor that affects many societies in the world, and one that must be addressed before moving forward.
This was my own production, and it's not based on a real-life story. Jealousy is an issue that affects most marriages in any society. I produced this song in 1969 and recorded it in 1971.
Years after making a name for himself in the local entertainment industry, 70-year-old Farah Sido Farah found himself touring the world alongside other veteran Somali artists. The world tour will see him travel as far as Russia, Italy, and Germany. He also staged numerous musical performances in major capitals in the African continent, including Egypt and Nigeria. But a brutal civil war in the early 90s saw the destruction of the country's music industry. This national theatre, constructed by Chinese engineers, was badly destroyed, forcing many artists to flee the country. Farah and several others remained behind to ensure that the next generation of artists understand the value of culture, music, and arts.
More investment is needed to nurture the Somali music industry. Arts, music, and culture is part of the identity of any given society. Authorities must protect and encourage the growth of music because it can be used to pass important messages and it can be used in awareness campaigns.
In Mogadishu and many other cities, young artists have emerged and embraced traditional ways of playing music. Entertainment spots like this are filled to capacity every weekend as the old and young generation meet to remind themselves of the good old days with classic hits from the past. Abdulaziz Bilo, CGTN, Mogadishu, Somalia.
Here's a look at what's coming up in your sports news up next. CAF's disciplinary committee declares ES Tunis winners of the disputed Champions League final.
Africa, where champions are made, records are broken, legends are born. We're there for every goal, for every knockout, for every step of the way.
Match Point, only on CGTN.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
The Confederation of African